Last Thanksgiving, my friend and I, we were both 21 at the time, were driving home from college. I live in a really isolated part of Arkansas, and to get there, you have to drive through an hour of mountain roads filled with hairpin turns. There are blind corners everywhere, and the entire time you're basically on the edge of these massive drop-offs. No barriers, no safety net. Normally, I'm pretty confident driving through the mountains, but this time, we were in my friend's car, so I was being extra cautious. Still, I was going about 5 miles over the speed limit. Not long after we hit the roughest stretch of the drive, another car came up behind us and started tailgating. And I mean really close. It was stressing me out, and as soon as I found a spot where I could pull over, I did. It was a church parking lot. My friend offered to take over driving, but I said no. It was pitch black outside, and she'd never driven this route before. I didn't want to risk it. We got back on the road, but just a few minutes later, I had to slam on the brakes. Out of nowhere, there was a car stopped in the middle of the road. Not on the shoulder or anything, right in the middle. Dead still. My friend thought maybe they'd broken down and couldn't call for a tow since there's no cell service in that area. But the whole situation gave me a bad feeling. I locked the doors right away and told her to stay in the car no matter what. That's when she pointed out something I hadn't even considered. I think that's the same car that was tailgating us. I couldn't tell for sure, but my stomach dropped. If it was the same car, this wasn't some random breakdown. The road was so narrow, and the car was parked just before a sharp hairpin turn, so there was no way to safely pass it. My friend kept telling me to just go around, but I was terrified. What if another car came flying around the corner? What if we slid off the edge of the mountain? I honked the horn. Nothing. No one got out of the car, and it didn't move an inch. We couldn't call for help. There was no cell service, and we were completely alone on that road. The fear was starting to creep in. Something about this didn't feel right at all. We just sat there, waiting. I didn't know what else to do. My friend was crying, freaking out, begging me to do something, but I was too scared to try passing him. The mountain road was too dangerous, and the whole situation felt so wrong. I honked a few more times, hoping he'd move, but instead, the driver got out of his car. He walked around to the back of his car and leaned against it, just staring at us. He didn't check his car or anything, just stood there, casually, like he had all the time in the world. My friend was losing it by now, full-on sobbing, but I told her not to look at him. Don't make eye contact. I was frozen, gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. I was ready to slam on the gas if he did anything, but he didn't. He just stood there, staring at us. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, praying another car would come along. Any car. Anything to break this standoff. It felt like forever, but it was probably 15 minutes or so. The whole time he didn't say a word, didn't move, just leaned there, watching us. Then finally, I saw headlights coming up behind us in the mirror. The moment he saw the lights, he turned, jogged to his car, and got back in. Without hesitation, he sped off, flying down the road like a maniac. There was nothing wrong with his car. I waited for the other car to pass, then started driving again, carefully but quickly. I just wanted to get out of there, but I didn't want to cause an accident either. My friend was still shaken, and honestly, so was I. For a while, the road was quiet again, and I thought maybe we'd seen the last of him. But then, we passed his car. It was parked on the shoulder, waiting, As soon as we passed, he pulled back onto the road and started tailing us. Again. This time, I tried speeding up, hoping to lose him, but no matter how fast I went, he stayed right behind us. By now, we had cell service, but I wasn't sure if calling the cops was the right move. What would I even say? Nothing had really happened yet. So instead, I called home. I told my brothers what was going on and asked them to wait for us on the porch. They said they'd be there, and knowing they'd be ready made me feel a little safer. But the guy kept following us, all the way home, even down our long gravel driveway. When we pulled up, my two brothers were waiting on the porch, both holding their deer rifles. As soon as the guy saw them, he stopped at the end of the driveway, turned around, and sped off back the way he'd come. We tried to catch his license plate, but it was too dark, and we couldn't make it out. My friend and I were shaken, to say the least. But later, when I told some other friends about what happened, they just shrugged it off, like it wasn't a big deal. Even now, I can't stop thinking about how it could have gone differently. What if my brothers hadn't been there? What if we'd tried passing him on that mountain road? It's one of those things that feels small when you tell it, but in the moment, it felt life or death. This happened about 6 or 7 years ago. Back then, I played soccer for 1 year at my community college after high school. That's how I met this guy. He worked for the athletics department. He was another student, and at first, he seemed pretty normal. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I had this 1-hour gap between classes, so I usually hung out in the library to study or kill time. One day, he noticed me there and asked what I was doing. I told him about my gap, and after that, he started showing up regularly to hang out during that hour. At first, I didn't mind. He seemed like an okay guy, and it wasn't like I had much else to do. But looking back, there were little things that were off. For one, he didn't have a reason to be there. He wasn't waiting for a class or studying. He was just hanging out, and it started to feel like he was showing up specifically for me. Then, there were the gifts. Every now and then, he'd bring me something small, like chocolate or candy. I thought it was sweet, but a little odd, considering I barely knew him. He always downplayed it, though, like, they had extra Kit Kat bars in the office. Do you want one? He never said he went out and bought it for me. But now that I look back, I think that's exactly what he was doing. It's like he knew outright gift-giving might be too much and wanted to make it seem casual. The soccer season ended before Thanksgiving, and only the playoff teams kept playing after that, not us. After Thanksgiving, it was finals season, so things were pretty hectic. During that short period between soccer ending and Thanksgiving break, he started asking about my schedule for the next semester. Honestly, I hadn't figured it out yet. I wasn't super organized with course registration, and the counselors at my school were no help. I didn't tell him all that, but I did mention I didn't want to have another hour-long gap in my schedule, because it felt like such a waste of time. He didn't seem happy to hear that. I didn't think much of it in the moment, but now I wonder why it bothered him so much. He also asked me if I was planning to play another soccer season, and I told him no. I needed to manage my time better, and soccer just wasn't helping. It was fun, but playing every day took too much of my focus, and I had other priorities. Looking back, I think my mistake was oversharing. Just saying too much without thinking about how it might land with him. I had a bad habit of being unfiltered like that back then, not realizing how my words could affect other people. That was the last Thursday before Thanksgiving. After that, there were no more hour-long gaps to hang out. We went on Thanksgiving break, took our finals, and then had winter break. For a little while, everything was fine. Life felt normal again. Then winter break rolled around, and that's when things started to get bad. It began with him showing up outside my house, sitting in his car in the mornings. The first time, I couldn't believe it. I told myself it had to be a coincidence. But the second time, I checked more carefully, and it was him. There was no mistaking it. At that point, it was clear to both of us what was going on. He was stalking me, and it didn't stop there. I used to post on Instagram stories, just casual stuff about where I was or what I was doing. Somehow, he started showing up at those places. Stores at the mall, coffee shops, wherever. I'd post about being at a girly store he'd have zero reason to be in, and then he'd show up. It got to the point where he started pointing his phone at me, like he was taking pictures. That part was even creepier. I stopped using social media after that. I couldn't deal with the thought of him tracking me anymore. But even without social media, the stalking continued. After winter break, he started coming by during the afternoons too, especially when my parents were at work. I called the cops a few times, but nothing ever came of it. He didn't trespass, didn't make threats, didn't have a weapon, nothing that would technically get him in trouble. He was careful, just staying barely within the boundaries of the law. The cops tried talking to him, but he refused to engage. He knew exactly what he was doing. I don't know what he's doing now. My guess is that he eventually got bored or found someone else to fixate on. At least, that's what I hope. But honestly, if he still drives by, I have no idea. I try not to think about it. The hardest part, I couldn't tell my parents. I knew they'd freak out, and I didn't want them to carry that worry. So I dealt with it on my own, and that made it all the more exhausting. I'm a proud Floridian, born and raised. Back in the early 2000s, when this story took place, I was in college down in South Florida, but lived with my family up in the Florida Panhandle. That's about a 7-hour drive straight up through Central Florida, so I usually only made the trip home for holidays. It was Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I was pumped. I'd managed to rearrange my midterms so I could leave campus 3 days earlier than everyone else. My plan was simple: beat the holiday traffic and make it home in record time. My roommates and I had one last meal together in the dining hall around 4 p.m., and by 5:30, I was on the road. The trip was going smoothly. By 10 p.m., I was about 2/3 of the way home. That's when I hit my usual stop, a little mom-and-pop diner just off the highway. I always stopped there for a snack, a bathroom break, and to use the payphone to call my dad. No cell phone for me yet. But when I pulled in, I realized the place was out of business. It hadn't been that long since my last trip, but the lights were off, the windows boarded up, and my dreams of chocolate chip pancakes were officially crushed. Feeling a little bummed, I decided to keep going. The area wasn't exactly bustling. There weren't a lot of other places to stop, but eventually, I saw a sign for a rest stop in a little town called Alachua. I think that's how it's spelled. I figured it would do. When I pulled into the rest stop, I parked directly under a streetlight. You know, for safety. I used the facilities, stretched my legs, and called my dad to let him know everything was fine. The place was mostly deserted, except for this one exhausted-looking woman who came up to me as I was heading back to my car. She said she was traveling with her husband and 2 young kids, trying to get to Disney, but had made a wrong turn somewhere. She asked me for directions, and I did my best to help her out before heading back to my car. That's when I noticed it. Parked this close to the driver's side of my '95 Honda Civic was a beat-up, unmarked van. It was gray or maybe bluish. It was hard to tell under the streetlights, and it looked like the kind of work van you see in movies when something bad is about to happen. My first thought? That's weird. It had Florida plates, so it definitely wasn't the woman's van. She said she was from Virginia. The whole thing felt off. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. I turned right around and hightailed it back toward the rest stop, where I almost ran into this middle-aged guy with 2 little boys. As I was catching my breath, the woman I'd spoken to earlier emerged from the bathroom. It turned out they were a family traveling together. Something about their presence made me feel safe enough to explain what was going on with the van. I told the guy everything. How it was parked way too close to my car, how it didn't belong to the woman, and how I had no idea what to do. He listened, glanced over at the van, and said, "All right, I'll go check it out." Before heading over, he left the kids with his wife and strutted confidently toward the van. I could see him approach the driver's side and stand there for a moment, hesitating. Then, his voice cracked as he yelled, loud enough for us to hear from about 100 feet away. "Excuse me, gentlemen. We already called the police, so I'm going to have to politely suggest that you get out of here." And then, he bolted. He sprinted back to us, grabbed his wife and kids, pointed at me, and barked, "You! Let's go! Now! Get in the car!" I didn't argue. The next thing I knew, I was crammed into the back of their SUV, completely confused, as he ran to the payphone to actually call the police. Meanwhile, the van peeled out like nothing I've ever seen. These guys couldn't get out of there fast enough. They drove up on the curb, tires screeching, burning rubber. Honestly, it would have been funny if it weren't so terrifying. When the cops arrived, we all explained what happened, and that's when I got the full picture. The man said he could see into the van pretty clearly because I had parked under the streetlight. All the seats except the driver's seat had been removed. There was a guy sitting in the driver's seat and another guy sitting in the back. The floor was covered by a tarp, and there was a bunch of random stuff in there, things he couldn't immediately identify. And the creepiest part, they weren't doing anything normal, like reading a map or even pretending to fiddle with something. They were just sitting there, watching, waiting. The whole thing still makes me sick to think about. I don't even want to imagine what could have happened if I'd gone straight to my car that night instead of turning back.